They say you could survive war, famine, even the wrath of kings, but you would never survive crossing paths with Ishtar. Tonight, we unravel the story of the Mesopotamian goddess of love and war, a figure so beautiful she could intoxicate nations, yet so dangerous she left kings shattered and lovers destroyed. This is not a simple myth. It's a story of desire, betrayal, and power that shaped the ancient world and still lingers in the night sky. Before we dive into it, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep, mythic stories told in a way that helps you drift off while still learning the legends of the past. Picture the cradle of civilization, cities rising along the rivers of Mesopotamia, temples glowing with firelight, hymns echoing through stone halls. And at the heart of it all, a goddess no one could resist. To love her was bliss, to defy her was ruin. She was the star that guided travelers at dawn and dusk, the lioness that tore through battlefields, the queen whose throne stretched from heaven to the underworld. She was Ishtar. And if you think love is dangerous now, you should see what it meant when she walked among mortals. Under the vast Mesopotamian sky, where stars shimmered faintly above the deserts, people whispered the name of a goddess who was as irresistible as she was dangerous. Ishtar, the queen of heaven. She was the goddess of love, of war, of fertility, of storms, and none of these roles ever canceled out the others. She was tenderness and terror fused together, passion that could bless fields with abundance one moment and leave armies crushed under the weight of her fury the next. If you imagine her temples rising above the ancient cities, you can almost sense the devotion mixed with fear. Priests climbed the steps of the ziggurats with offerings in hand, not out of casual affection, but because they knew what happened if she was ignored. A goddess like Ishtar was not to be courted gently. She was to be appeased, respected, and never underestimated. She appears in hymns as luminous as the morning star itself, blazing against the early dawn. Yet in carvings and statues, she was shown armed, standing atop a lion, her wings spread wide, her eyes unyielding. This was not a soft goddess of springtime flowers. This was desire weaponized, beauty sharpened into a blade. Her lovers never fared well. Dumuzi, the shepherd who once held her heart, found himself dragged into the underworld when she tired of him. Gilgamesh, the great king, rejected her, thinking himself clever for pointing out the fate of her past companions. But if you cross paths with someone like Ishtar, cleverness will not save you. His refusal unleashed the bull of heaven, a beast so destructive that even victory against it carried a curse. The message was clear. To win her favor was risky, but to deny her was catastrophic. And yet, no one could escape her orbit. She was the very rhythm of life, the spark of attraction, the roar of conflict. To live in Mesopotamia was to live in her shadow, whether you wanted to or not. Ishtar's presence was not just felt in rituals of love, but in the clamor of battle. She strode through warfields as easily as she did through sacred chambers. Ancient poems described her eyes as blazing torches, her voice as both lure and command. To encounter her was to be undone, not slowly, but in a rush, as though swept away by a storm you had no chance of escaping. And if you think being loved by her would be safer, history proves otherwise. Her lovers were transformed, destroyed, or discarded. The stallion, once adored, was eventually broken, driven until exhaustion. The lion, once her companion, was crippled. The shepherd, abandoned. Passion with Ishtar was never protection. It was a fire that burned bright enough to consume its own fuel. Gilgamesh saw this. He was one of the few bold enough to look at her pattern and say no. When she offered him her hand, he listed each of her past lovers like warning signs nailed to a crumbling wall. It was the ancient world's version of scrolling through a profile and realizing every past relationship ended in disaster. But saying no to Ishtar was like trying to outwit a hurricane. She stormed to her father, demanded the bull of heaven, and loosed it upon Uruk. Even in victory, the cost was unbearable. Gilgamesh and Enkidu struck the beast down, but the gods decreed a price must be paid. Enkidu's death followed, and Gilgamesh's story of grief and despair began. That was the kind of aftermath Ishtar left behind. With her, there was no clean escape. The Mesopotamians understood this in a way that feels uncomfortably familiar even now. Love, desire, and fury often ride the same currents, and when the goddess who embodied them approached, survival was never guaranteed. Among the gods of Mesopotamia, Ishtar refused to be contained. Shamash ruled the sun, Enlil commanded the storm, Ea held dominion over the waters. They had boundaries. Ishtar ignored boundaries. She stretched herself across love, war, fertility, storms, vengeance, and desire. The result was a goddess both essential and terrifying. If you prayed to her for a harvest, you also risked stirring her wrath in battle. If you sought her blessing for fertility, you invited her storms. There was no separating one side of her from the other. To honor Ishtar was to acknowledge the entire spectrum of life, the joy and the ruin, the attraction and the heartbreak, the triumph and the collapse. Her temples reflected this restless energy. In Uruk, Babylon, and Nineveh, her sanctuaries thrummed with sacred rites, ritual sexuality bound directly to her myths. Priests and priestesses enacted the goddess's independence, merging devotion with performance, channeling her dual nature of tenderness and power. Outsiders often misunderstood, but to her worshippers, these rites were nothing less than essential. If you were a soldier seeking her favor, you might walk into battle with her fire coursing through your veins. But survival was never guaranteed. She might lift you into frenzy, or she might abandon you at the height of the fight. This was not a goddess of morality. Ishtar was never about right or wrong. She was power, pure and unpredictable. Hymns praised her for raising kings to thrones and tearing them down, for filling hearts with desire and then emptying them with betrayal. She was life itself, not kind, not fair, but constant in her unpredictability. And if you think about it, that's exactly what made her indispensable. She was not a comfort. She was inevitability. Her descent into the underworld reveals this most clearly. Restless as ever, she chose to confront death itself, venturing into the realm of her sister, Ereshkigal. At each of the 7 gates she passed, something was stripped away: her crown, her jewels, her garments, until she stood powerless, bare, a goddess reduced to nothing. It is one of the oldest dramas humanity preserved, and even now it feels raw. The Queen of Heaven forced to confront the silence of the grave. For a moment, it seemed even Ishtar had limits. The world above mirrored her absence. Crops failed. Animals ceased to mate. Desire itself disappeared. Without her, life withered. The gods panicked. It turned out that the chaos everyone feared was also the same chaos that kept the world alive. She returned, but not without a cost. Someone else had to go down in her place, and she chose Dumuzi, a former lover sacrificed with the flick of her hand. Some versions softened the betrayal by sharing his fate across seasons, tying his suffering to cycles of growth and decay. But the cruelty remained. Love with Ishtar could condemn as easily as it exalted. If you've ever seen passion twist into blame, you already understand this story. The ancients knew it too. They simply magnified it into myth, showing how even the most radiant goddess was driven by the same contradictions as humanity itself. For Ishtar, those contradictions weren't flaws, they were her essence. And so the story of her descent was told again and again, not as a warning to avoid her, because avoiding her was impossible, but as a reminder that every act of passion carries a shadow, and every fire casts both light and smoke. Ishtar's cult was not confined to a single city. Her worship spread like wildfire, shaping rituals and politics from Uruk to Babylon, from Nineveh to Assyria. Wherever her name was invoked, you found the same mixture of reverence and unease. She was adored, but never trusted. People needed her for fertility, for victory, for passion, yet they also braced themselves for the cost of her presence. Priests and priestesses carried her rites into the heart of society. Inscriptions describe temple economies bustling with offerings, grain, livestock, precious metals, all given in hope that Ishtar's volatile favor might be secured. Sacred sexuality was at the core of some rituals, reenacting her myths in flesh and blood. Outsiders later twisted these practices into scandalous rumors, but in truth they were acts of devotion, attempts to align human life with the chaos of divine power. The paradox was everywhere. Kings claimed her blessing for their rule, yet also feared her ability to overturn thrones. One moment she crowned a warrior, the next she toppled him. That was the danger of inviting her into politics. Power came swiftly, but it was never guaranteed to stay. If you imagine yourself in that world, you'd see the gamble. If you, aligning with Ishtar, could lift an empire, but just as easily, it could unravel one overnight. Her myths reminded everyone of this truth. She was not a goddess of stability. She was a goddess of movement, of force, of disruption. Love was never quiet in her stories. It was obsession. It was betrayal. It was the kind of passion that consumed kingdom. War was not a strategy, but a frenzy, a rush of blood that left fields littered with corpses. The people didn't worship her, despite these contradictions. They worshipped her because of them. Life itself was full of desire, destruction, betrayal, and rebirth. In many ways, Ishtar wasn't just a goddess of these forces. She was those forces embodied, the storm given a name and a face. The story of Gilgamesh rejecting her remains one of the sharpest illustrations of her danger. It wasn't simply that he said no. It was the way he said it. He listed her history like a string of failed romances, as if he were holding up a mirror to her chaos. This lover became a crippled lion, that one, a broken horse, that shepherd abandoned to wolves. Each example was a reminder that her affection was deadly. If you've ever been in a conversation where someone is brutally honest, too honest, you know the tension. Gilgamesh chose honesty over survival, and the result was predictable. Ishtar's fury boiled over. She stormed to the heavens, demanded the bowl of heaven, and sent it crashing into Uruk. Crops shriveled, famine spread, the ground itself seemed cursed. The city paid the price for their king's sharp tongue. You can almost picture the scene. Ishtar, standing above the chaos, eyes alight with satisfaction as terror swept through Uruk. To her, destruction was not failure. It was proof of her power. And even when the bull was slain, the victory meant nothing. Gilgamesh's closest companion, Enkidu, would soon be taken by death. His fall into illness and despair was traced directly to that moment of defiance. This was how Ishtar's myths always worked. She was a goddess who taught lessons through extremes. If you submitted, you might be lifted high for a time. If you resisted, you were broken. Either way, her presence left a mark. There was no neutrality with her, no safe middle ground. To encounter her was to be swept into the current, whether you wanted it or not. The ancients understood something here. Passion and destruction often arrive together, two sides of the same current. Ishtar was not just a goddess who ruled them, she was their embodiment. To see her walking into a city was to know that change, violent, ecstatic, irreversible, was about to follow. On the tablets that survived fire and conquest, Ishtar is called Lady of the Battlefield, she who breaks ranks, she whose roar scatters armies. Assyrian kings carried her standard into campaigns as if carrying a captured storm. In reliefs carved for palaces at Nineveh, victorious rulers credited her with every decisive turn. The sudden rout of an enemy, the arrow that found a seam in armor, the horse that did not stumble at the crucial moment. If you marched beneath her name, you were expected to move like lightning, to strike and vanish, to return with spoils and songs before your rations ran out. No general boasted, without adding that Ishtar had leaned in his direction that day. Her symbols followed the troops like a second sun: the eight-pointed star, the lion, the bow and quiver. On temple doors and boundary stones, the star glimmered as both warning and invitation, a reminder that desire and violence share a pulse. You might think of it as a logo, ancient branding etched into clay and stone, but it worked like an oath. Soldiers rubbed amulets before battle, kissed them, slipped them back into tunics stiff with sweat. If the day went well, they promised offerings. If it went badly, they promised more. Bargaining with Ishtar had a peculiar logic. That lose and you owed her, win and you owed her, draw and you certainly owed her. In the cities, her processions stitched the social fabric as tightly as any law. At Uruk's Ayanna precinct, drums rolled like distant thunder while priestesses moved in slow spirals, hair oiled, garments bright with stitched rosettes. Sacred music shook dust from the rafters. You can almost hear the low hum of reeds and frame drums, the press of bodies in the courtyard, the smell of warm bitumen and frankincense. On devotion mingled with heat, rites of sacred union reenacted the joining of goddess and king. A ceremonial marriage meant to oil the hinges of the seasons. Crops were expected to listen. So were the rivers. The fact that nature rarely complies did not lessen the drama, but it intensified it. Ishtar was useful to rulers because she was dangerous to them. A king could claim her as patron. He could even dress his victories in her language. But he could not own her. In letters to oracles, you catch the anxiety under the gold. Questions about omens, about whether the goddess favored a march in spring or a treaty in autumn. The most confident inscriptions read like statements to convince the author, we conquered because Ishtar desired it. We lived because Ishtar blinked. If you have ever spoken bravely while checking the door twice, you understand their tone. And then there was the gate, the great blue radiance of Babylon's Ishtar Gate. Glazed bricks the color of deep water, animals in file like a parade that never ends. Striding lions for the goddess, bulls for Adad, dragons for Marduk, a bestiary of empire frozen mid-step. Pilgrims entering the city walked beneath her star and felt the slight lift in the chest that architecture gives when it chooses to be merciful. You could taste it. The promise that power will hold, that walls will stand, that a name inscribed in fired clay might outlast flood and fire. But even in triumph, her presence was a blade with two edges. She who exalts, can also strip. She who crowns can unmake a brow into dust. Kings learned to speak softly at her altars, even when the world cheered loudly outside. And further north, in Assyria, her aspect hardened like iron in quenching water. She appears in visions, sword in hand, chariot wheels throwing sparks, hair unbound like a banner at speed. When letters recorded that she went before the troops, it meant courage spiked like wine, and the price, if unpaid, would follow later. You can stand in the shadow of those palaces today and feel the echo, not of speeches or treaties, but of hooves, the rhythmic beat of campaign drums, a star carved again and again, until stone remembered the pattern more readily than rain remembered the sky. Her star in the sky made sense of her contradictions. Ishtar is Venus, the morning and evening light that appears and vanishes, faithful in routine yet slippery in meaning. Priests tracked the planet's cycle with a precision that would satisfy any modern scheduler. First, as a bright spear at dawn, then lost in the sun's glare, then blooming again at dusk, a flower reopening at the edge of night. If you have watched Venus hang low over the horizon and felt a tug you cannot name, you already understand why a civilization mapped a goddess across the heavens. Omen compendia, read like weather for the soul. If Ishtar rises early and bright, the king's campaigns prosper. If she disappears longer than expected, famine nips at the fields. If she gleams red, blood follows. The tablets are dense with ifs, 1,000 conditional steps between star and harvest, throne and grave. You might call it superstition, yet it is also a kind of poetry, a way of saying that what happens to the sky happens to us, that the pulse of desire and the pulse of war answer to the same bell. The planet's brilliance at dawn promised beginnings. Its glow at dusk suggested closures. And in both, people saw her hand, opening doors with one finger and closing them with the next. Imagine a rooftop in Babylon, the bricks still warm from day, jars cooling in shallow basins, a scribe squinting at the horizon with a polished bronze disc in hand. A priest notes the hour, whispers an incantation so soft it barely disturbs the moths. Venus brightens by invisible increments. The city below exhales. A lover thinks of a promise. A merchant of the caravans due from the west. A soldier of the next campaign. The star gathers all these thoughts without effort. And because humans are what we are, they call it meaning. You can feel the relief in their records when the cycle behaves. You can feel the unease when it stutters. Her double appearance taught a moral larger than law courts ever could. Love and war are not opposite poles. They are morning and evening of the same light. In songs, she is called the opener of the womb and the breaker of shields, the delight of kings and the ruin of bold men. When Venus rose unexpected crimson, priests advised caution. Delay a march, sweeten a treaty, cut the throat of an extra lamb, and hope the goddess likes the gesture. When it shone clear as clean silver, doors opened, marriages arranged, treaties sealed, caravans loosed like arrows toward distant ports where resin and lapis waited. Modern life keeps other calendars, digital pings instead of tablets, but the old rhythm still touches you if you let it. Step out just before dawn. You may see a cold, bright point hanging above roofs and cranes, a single note held from the night's last chord. People once thought that point judged them, loved or hated them, chose their fortunes. The truth inside the myth is simpler and more human, that we choose, then live with the weather of those choices. And we give that weather a name so we can bear it. For Mesopotamia, the name was Ishtar, whose light outlived 1,000 fires. And when her star sank, the city did not fall silent. It drifted into the next task, with her absence humming underneath, like a string still vibrating after the musician's hand has lifted. Records continue, taxes counted, rations weighed, a bride price negotiated with more tact than a treaty. Yet at the edges of every ledger, the sky waits. Priests add a notation: Ishtar dim, Ishtar bright, omens favorable if the king is humble, warnings if pride walks tall. The advice is always the same and never easy: to honor the light when it comes, endure the dark when it goes, and never pretend you are strong enough to stand outside the cycle. That was her law, older than clay, written where even fire cannot erase it. The lion was her animal, fierce and unyielding. In carvings, she stood upon its back as if upon a living throne, hand gripping bow or weapon, wings stretching beyond the frame. To the people who watched lions prowl the edges of the desert, this symbol carried no softness. It was not metaphor, it was proof. The goddess, who could place her heel upon a lion's mane, had tamed violence itself, bent the wild to her pulse. When soldiers looked upon such an image, they saw their own hope magnified, to stride into danger with the confidence of one who cannot fall. But the myth reminds you, her lovers, even those who shared her bed, often ended as broken as the beasts at her feet. One tale says the stallion she loved was driven to ruin. Another, that the shepherd she adored was turned into a wolf. The message lingered. The desire from Ishtar was never gentle. If you found yourself in her embrace, you might feel like the lion at first, but sooner or later, you became the prey. Even so, worshippers carried her lions into battle, painted them onto shields, etched them into amulets. It was a strange bargain, to fear her and love her at the same time. But maybe that's how all relationships with power work. You don't have to trust it. You only have to admit you can't live without it. And Ishtar, in every form, was power. Her symbols weren't confined to lions. The rosette, too, belonged to her, a stylized blossom, sometimes 8-petaled, echoing the star of Venus. It adorned jewelry, bricks, seals, and textiles. It was smaller than a lion, gentler than a spear, but it meant the same thing: the presence of the goddess stamped into the material world. If you held a seal with her rosette, you carried a reminder that beauty and peril often bloom from the same root. And there was the bow, not the hunting bow of the lonely archer, but the war bow, strung to snap, meant for volleys across a battlefield. In hymns, she is the archeress who rains down fire. Imagine standing on an ancient plain, shield heavy on your arm, and hearing the rush of arrows above. To believe that the flight was guided by her hand might bring comfort or terror, depending on which side of the volley you stood. Together, these symbols built her mythology not as abstract philosophy, but as a language carved into stone, sung into hymns, woven into fabric. They turned the chaos of desire, of war, of passion, into signs people could hold. And even though the lion, the rosette, the star, the bow seem separate, they are facets of the same truth. When you look at them, you are looking at Ishtar herself, and she is always looking back. Her influence spilled far beyond Mesopotamia's river valleys. Cultures borrowed her name, reshaped her face, carried her across seas. To the Akkadians, she was Ishtar. To the Sumerians, Inanna. To the Canaanites, Astarte. To the Greeks, Aphrodite. To the Romans, Venus. Each translation smoothed a corner or sharpened an edge, but none erased the core. She remained the goddess of irresistible attraction and destructive force, the morning and evening star that lured and punished in equal measure. If you trace the line, you see how myths migrate. The Greeks emphasized beauty. The Romans polished it into elegance. But even in those later forms, the old shadows lingered. Behind Aphrodite's smile is the memory of Ishtar's storm. Behind Venus's grace is the echo of lions roaring outside Uruk. Civilization rebranded her, but the raw material never changed. When you read the myths side by side, the continuity is almost eerie. Ishtar unleashes the bull of heaven. Aphrodite sparks the Trojan War. Ishtar descends into the underworld. Persephone is taken below. The patterns recur, as if humanity cannot stop telling the same story with new costumes. And maybe that's the point. Love and chaos, beauty and ruin are constants. We simply rename them to match the tongue we speak. Imagine a sailor on the Mediterranean, centuries after Uruk's glory has faded. He looks up at Venus on the horizon and mutters a prayer to Aphrodite for safe passage. He does not know he is whispering to the same power that once rattled the gates of Babylon. But the star knows. It has heard these prayers in Sumerian, Akkadian, Greek, Latin. It does not change. Only the names spoken beneath it shift. That endurance is the real lesson. Empires collapse, tablets crack, languages vanish, but the goddess persists. She survives not because she is kind, but because she embodies what humans cannot escape: attraction and destruction walking hand in hand. Whether you call her Ishtar, Inanna, Astarte, Aphrodite, or Venus, the force remains. And if you stand under a clear sky and see the bright star in the west, you are part of that same chain. You may not build temples, you may not burn incense, but your heart still beats faster at beauty, still fears loss, still chases what might undo you. In that sense, you are already her worshiper, even if you never speak her name. To understand Ishtar, you also have to descend with her to the underworld, where the story shifts from thunder and passion to silence and shadow. The tale of her descent is one of the oldest surviving myths, and like all of her stories, it resists easy interpretation. Was it a quest for power, a rescue mission, or a confrontation with her own mortality? Each retelling bends the light differently, but the journey remains the same. The goddess of love and war, stepping into the land of no return. She approaches the gates of the underworld, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. At each gate, she is stripped of something: crown, earrings, necklace, girdle, bracelets, robe. By the seventh gate, she stands naked and bowed, the ornaments of power peeled away like layers of illusion. You can feel the drama in this moment. The goddess who commanded armies, who bent kings to her desire, reduced to flesh alone. For listeners then and now, this stripping carries a message. No matter how high you climb, no matter what lions you stand upon, the underworld waits. The great equalizer is not war, but silence, not passion, but dust. If you imagine yourself passing those gates, losing piece after piece of what makes you you, the story stops being remote. It becomes personal. Once inside, Ishtar is judged, struck down, and hung like a carcass on a hook. The world above falters. Crops cease, desire ebbs, animals refuse to breed. Without her, life pauses, as if the universe itself holds its breath. It is only through trickery and the intervention of other gods that she returns, restored to the surface, fierce and furious. Yet her freedom comes at a price. Another must take her place. That burden falls on her lover Dumuzi, dragged screaming into the shadows as she rises. It is one of those cruel turns that define her myths. Love is never pure gift in her stories. It is always entangled with loss. For every embrace, there is abandonment. For every victory, a ruin. And yet, humans kept telling and retelling this descent. Why? Because they saw themselves in it. Every season that dies into winter, every lover lost, every joy cut short carries Ishtar's imprint. She descends. She returns. She drags others down with her. And in that cycle, the world keeps turning. The descent also tells you something about the Mesopotamian view of power. Ishtar does not enter the underworld humbly. She storms its gates, demanding passage. Her sister Ereshkigal does not weep or yield. She waits and destroys. The sisters mirror each other. One rules passion, the other silence. One makes the world bloom, the other makes it still. Together, they form a whole truth about existence. You can fight as loudly as you like. Eventually, the other half of the cycle catches you. Artists showed her ascent just as vividly as her fall. Clay plaques depict her emerging, with wings spread, flanked by owls, standing atop lions, naked yet crowned once again. The message was unmistakable. Even death could not keep her. Yet it also reminded worshippers that her survival demanded sacrifice. Dumuzi's cries echo in hymns. A shepherd turned into a symbol of seasonal dying. Each year his fate was mourned, then celebrated as he returned with the spring. This drama seeped into daily life. Festivals reenacted her descent and return. Priests and priestesses embodied her fury and triumph, lamenting Dumuzi's fall and exalting his rebirth. If you lived in those cities, you would not have thought of myth as a story told only at night. It was theater, ritual, economy, politics. The goddess's journey through shadow was part of the rhythm of planting and harvesting, of mourning and feasting. Even in its darkest turn, Ishtar strung up like meat in the underworld, the myth does not collapse into despair. Instead, it affirms a cycle. The world halts, then begins again. Desire stops, then stirs once more. It is a pattern you know in your own life, whether or not you name it as myth. Every loss followed by recovery, every silence broken by sound, is a small reenactment of Ishtar's passage through shadow. And that may be why the story still whispers to you today. It is not only about gods and goddesses. It is about how fragile we are, how easily the ornaments we wear are stripped away, and how, despite it all, we rise again, never unscarred, but still moving, still breathing, still reaching for the light above. If you walk back into the temples after hearing of her descent, you see them differently. The towering ziggurats, the incense curling like snakes in the air, the carved offerings, all of it carried the weight of that story. Worshippers knew they were not simply flattering a goddess of beauty, but they were addressing the one who had gone down into silence and returned. That made her dangerous and precious at the same time. You could not treat her lightly. To slight her was to invite collapse, not just in your private life, but in the harvest, in the strength of the army, in the very heartbeat of the city. Priests did their best to control that danger with ritual. They staged elaborate ceremonies to placate her, mixing awe with flattery, lament with celebration. Hymns preserved on clay tablets describe her as she who walks in splendor, the queen of heaven and earth, but also the lioness who tramples the foe. The tone is never one note. It oscillates between praise and pleading. You can almost hear the singers, their voices echoing through courtyards of brick, each line a negotiation. We honor you, we fear you, we need you. And then there was the sacred marriage ritual. Each year, the king would symbolically unite with the goddess, embodied by a high priestess, to ensure fertility and prosperity. Imagine the tension. The ruler of a city-state, draped in gold, reciting verses older than his crown, while beside him the priestess channels the goddess herself. To the people outside, it was not theater. It was survival. If the rite was pleasing, fields would ripen, armies would stand, children would be born. If it failed, the city might starve. You can feel the pressure in that kind of performance. When expect the eyes of a whole civilization watching. Modern readers sometimes see only the sensuality in these rituals, but the ancients saw responsibility. For them, desire and duty were woven into one. Ishtar was not a goddess you could flatter with incense alone. She demanded enactment, embodiment, surrender. Her myths reminded people that life itself comes with terms, often harsh ones. You don't get growth without decay, union without loss, love without the possibility of ruin. So when the people of Uruk or Babylon gathered in her courtyards, they weren't simply looking for blessings. They were admitting the truth of their condition. The goddess's story was their own, fragile, powerful, always on the edge of being undone. And in acknowledging that, they hoped to find stability, even if just for one more season. Her priests and priestesses carried reputations as fierce as the goddess herself. They were not passive servants, but mediators between divine volatility and human need. Some texts describe them in roles that blurred the boundaries of gender and identity, a reflection of Ishtar's refusal to be contained. She was male and female, lover and warrior, gentle and cruel. Those who served her mirrored that fluidity, embodying a power that unsettled as much as it reassured. Accounts from neighboring cultures often misunderstood this, painting Ishtar's cult as wild or indecent. But from within Mesopotamia, it was something more complex. It was recognition that desire itself does not follow neat lines. It bends, it shifts, it resists categories. If you served her, you had to live that truth in your own body. You became a walking reminder that the goddess's power was not abstract. It flowed through flesh and blood, and through song. Hymns dedicated to her still thrum with urgency, even after millennia of silence. They praise her as storm, as torch, as roaring lioness, as shining star. They plead with her for mercy. They scold her for cruelty. They beg her to turn her gaze kindly. Reading them, you sense that ancient worshippers felt free to argue with her. They did not worship in simple obedience. They negotiated. They wrestled. They dared to cry out against her wrath. And perhaps that is what devotion to Ishtar truly meant. Not blind surrender, but acknowledgement of the struggle between love and ruin. Temples dedicated to her stood at the heart of cities. Pilgrims traveled from distant regions to see them, carrying offerings of oil, wool, bread, and silver. The smell of cooking sacrifices mingled with the scent of flowers. The courtyards were never quiet. Musicians plucked lyres. Drums pounded in rhythm with chants. Merchants called out their wares nearby. Worship was not removed from life, it was entangled with it. Every prayer was offered in the same breath as commerce, politics, and family gossip. The goddess's presence was part of the city's noise, and at night, when Venus gleamed above the horizon, those temples would glow with torchlight. Worshippers looked upward and saw no distance between star and shrine. To honor Ishtar was to acknowledge that the heavens bent low over their roofs. To ignore her was to risk being crushed by the very forces that kept the world alive. When you trace Ishtar's influence into warfare, you begin to see why kings never felt safe in her favor. She was not the calm, predictable patron a ruler might wish for. She was passion weaponized, desire sharpened into strategy. In inscriptions, she appears before battles, her star blazing over the army, her roar scattering enemies, but the victories she granted came with a taste of frenzy. Soldiers believed her presence filled them with a heat that no shield could deflect. That might win the day. But afterward, who could quiet that fire? Some hymns describe her as she who dances on the battlefield, stepping between corpses with the same rhythm that priestesses carried into her festivals. The same goddess who stirred lovers in private chambers could stir soldiers into killing rapture. To you, this might seem like contradiction. To the ancients, it was simply truth. Desire and violence are kin. Both are sudden. Both consume. Both leave nothing unchanged. Archaeologists find traces of this devotion in weapons offered at her shrines. Broken blades, arrowheads, shields cracked by impact relics of men who wanted her favor. Imagine the sight. A chamber piled with rusted offerings, each one a story of a soldier who feared her absence more than he feared the enemy's spear. The shrine becomes less a storehouse of metal than a storehouse of human desperation. She did not belong solely to men, though. Women invoked her just as fiercely. Hymns of queens and priestesses call upon her to protect the city, to strengthen walls, to scatter armies that threaten children. The battlefield, in that sense, was not distant. It was the street outside, the granary, the river. When Ishtar was invoked, she was invoked for survival. And that survival required acknowledging her dual face. Love that comforts, love that destroys. If you stood in Uruk during a campaign season, you might have seen her processions leave the temple, standards lifted, priests chanting, soldiers beating shields in rhythm. The crowd followed, children perched on walls, women scattering petals. The goddess moved with them, invisible yet palpable. Everyone felt the weight of her attention. When the army marched out, there was always the question whispered in the crowd, will she return with them? And the answer, of course, was never certain. One of the strangest things about Ishtar's myth is how she keeps slipping beyond boundaries. She is never only one thing. In Sumerian hymns, she is tender lover. Tender. In Akkadian inscriptions, merciless warrior. In Omen tablets, a star of precision. In rituals, a force of fertility. Try to hold her in a single shape, and she dissolves. That is part of her danger. You cannot predict her. Even the gods feared this instability. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Ishtar proposes marriage to the hero, his rejection is scathing. He lists the fates of her former lovers: a bird with broken wings, a lion pierced by iron, a shepherd cursed. The message is cruel but plain. To accept her love is to invite ruin. Gilgamesh spits the truth aloud. He knows her passion burns hot, but leaves ash, and the goddess, humiliated, does what she always does. She unleashes devastation. This time, it is the bull of heaven, a cosmic beast sent crashing into Uruk, its hooves splitting the earth, its breath laying waste to fields. Thousands die, all because a hero mocked her. You can almost hear the panic in the city, the screams as the ground shakes, the prayers rushed out between breaths. And yet, Gilgamesh and Enkidu managed to kill the bull, cutting its heart, defying the goddess herself. But even victory brings consequence. Enkidu dreams of the gods' council, where it is decided that one of the heroes must die for their defiance. Soon after, sickness strikes him, and he withers. Gilgamesh, untouched, becomes haunted. The rejection of Ishtar has cost him his friend. The myth circles back to its lesson. You may resist her, you may mock her, you may even win against her agents. But the cost will arrive, heavy as iron. It's striking that the ancients never made her purely villainous. She is not a demon, not an enemy to be slain. She is simply a truth too large to escape. Love brings pain. Passion brings loss. Power brings ruin. If you cross her path, whether in battle or in bed, you walk into that truth. That is why kings feared her favor as much as her wrath. And that is why her stories have never disappeared. If you think about it, the Bull of Heaven episode almost feels like a warning carved in mythic stone. It says, here is what happens when you cross a boundary with Ishtar. Reject her too openly. Humiliate her in front of others. And she will not just scorn you. She will bring catastrophe to your entire city. In that sense, her myths were not simply entertainment. They were a manual of survival. The lesson wasn't subtle. Treat the goddess with respect, or watch the world crumble around you. And yet, the story is more complicated than vengeance alone. The Bull of Heaven is not some random weapon pulled from the void. It represents famine, drought, the cracking of earth, the drying of rivers. When Ishtar unleashes it, she is pulling on forces already feared by the people of Mesopotamia. A failed harvest, a river running low. These were not abstract terrors. They were matters of life and death. If you think of the bull in that light, the myth reads almost like an explanation for natural disaster. Why did the grain fail? Why did the animals starve? Because someone angered the goddess. That makes the story at once personal and cosmic. One man's rejection of Ishtar becomes a famine that touches every household. If you were a farmer watching your fields dry, it must have been tempting to wonder who in the city had offended her this time. Myths gave shape to the chaos. They turned random suffering into narrative, something you could endure because it had a reason, even if the reason was terrifying. And notice how the story ends, with Gilgamesh alive but broken. His defiance does not kill him, but it sets him on a path of mourning and despair. He has won a temporary victory, but it pushes him toward an existential quest for immortality. In that way, Ishtar doesn't just punish with disasters, she plants questions that corrode a hero's certainty. That, too, is part of her power. She doesn't simply destroy, she unsettles. If you step back and look at the cycle of her myths, a pattern emerges. Ishtar is always there at the hinge points. Love and betrayal, growth and decay, war and peace. She embodies transition itself, the place where certainty slips into chaos. That is why she was invoked in so many different roles. Farmers called on her for fertility. Soldiers begged her for victory. Lovers prayed for passion. And yet, everyone knew she could turn against them in a heartbeat. Some texts almost read like anxious letters. O goddess, do not turn your gaze against me. O goddess, protect me as I walk." The tone is pleading, not confident. You can feel the worshipper's awareness of how fragile their favor might be. To pray to Ishtar was to admit you were at her mercy. And yet, this was not a relationship of despair. It was a relationship of intensity. To love Ishtar was to live on the edge of fire, but for many, that edge was better than silence. Think of how many people, even today, chase relationships that promise both ecstasy and heartbreak. The pattern hasn't changed. It's as if human beings are wired to return again and again to the dangerous flame. That is what made her worship eternal. Her cults carried this flame into every corner of Mesopotamia and beyond. In Babylon, she was tied to Marduk, the great city god, forming part of the empire's religious core. In Assyria, she became a war goddess par excellence, invoked by kings who carved their victories into stone walls. In smaller cities, she appeared in humble shrines, where mothers prayed for children, or merchants begged for fortune on the road. Whether on the grand stage of empire or in the private grief of a household, she was there. And if you imagine walking those ancient streets, you would see her eyes everywhere, on temple gates, on cylinder seals pressed into clay, on jewelry dangling from a dancer's wrist. You couldn't escape her gaze. You wouldn't want to, because to live without Ishtar was to live without desire, without growth, without the terrible energy that makes life more than mere survival. She was risk itself, and risk was life. As centuries passed, Ishtar's image only grew more complex. In Akkadian hymns, she is called the torch of heaven and earth. And you can imagine how that felt for people who lived beneath endless skies lit only by stars, moon, and fire. To them, she was literal light in the darkness, both guiding and blinding. When Venus shone bright before sunrise, they saw her wandering across the heavens, restless as ever, the goddess who never truly slept. For farmers, this was an omen of fertility. For soldiers, it was a sign that war might soon be upon them. One star, two interpretations, and both correct. That's how Ishtar worked. It is telling that kings themselves invoked her before campaigns. Assyrian rulers, especially, carved inscriptions that almost read like love letters to the goddess of war. They credited her with making their arrows fly straight, their chariots roll fast, their enemies stumble. But woven into the boasting is always a note of nervousness. Because if Ishtar deserted you mid-battle, the tide could turn instantly. You can almost hear the desperation beneath the swagger. A king's crown might glitter, but without her favor, it was just a fragile ornament waiting to be trampled into the mud. The common people felt that same tension. A mother praying for a child might whisper thanks one day and grief the next, depending on whether her prayers were answered. A soldier leaving home might swear devotion before marching, only to curse her name if he fell wounded in the field. This unpredictability wasn't a flaw in her myth. It was the point. She reflected the lived reality of human beings, the truth that desire doesn't always reward you, that power doesn't guarantee safety, that love can ruin as quickly as it heals. What's remarkable is how open the ancients were about this paradox. They didn't need their goddess to be perfect. They needed her to be real. And Ishtar was as real as the storm that ruined your roof, as the lover who broke your heart, as the sudden fortune that lifted you from hunger. She was life distilled into a figure. And life, as everyone knew, could not be tamed. Her symbols tell the same story of duality. The lion was hers, fierce, unstoppable, ruler of the wild. You can still find carved reliefs of her standing with lions at her side, not as pets, but as extensions of her own fury. The lion made perfect sense as her companion. To see her was to feel hunted, even if you were the one doing the preying. And yet, the same goddess who strode with lions also held the date palm, a symbol of fertility, food, sweetness, two images that don't align neatly, but together they form the shape of her power. Then there is the star, the morning and evening light of Venus. To gaze up at that brilliant point, rising or falling, was to remember her presence. It is no wonder that across cultures, Venus became the goddess of love. But in Mesopotamia, it was never just softness. The star could signal war as easily as romance. Imagine watching the dawn sky and wondering, will this star bring harvest or famine? Will it bring a lover's touch or an army at the gates? Even the 8-pointed star that became her emblem carried weight. 8 rays, reaching in every direction, a sign that no corner of life escaped her reach. Love, war, wealth, destruction, all tied to a single figure. To carry that symbol on a seal or necklace was not just to honor her, it was to acknowledge that you lived in her web, that every choice you made might spark her attention. And once she noticed you, nothing would remain the same. If you think about it, there's almost something modern about her branding. She was everywhere, on walls, on gates, on jewelry, on statues. You couldn't avoid her image. It was as if the ancients already understood what corporations know today. Repetition creates power. But the difference was that Ishtar wasn't selling anything. She didn't need your purchase. She demanded your life, your devotion, your fear. That 8-pointed star wasn't just an advertisement. It was a reminder that you were never out of her sight. If you stood before the Ishtar gate of Babylon, you would have felt that gaze most of all. Towering walls glazed in deep blue, decorated with lions, dragons, and bulls, rising above the street like a challenge to the sky itself. Passing through it was not simply walking into a city, but it was entering her domain. Every brick shimmered with her presence. Every animal carved into the tiles proclaimed her force. Imagine being a traveler approaching Babylon for the first time. You would see that gate and know instantly, this city belongs to Ishtar. The lions on the walls were not decoration. They were a statement, a warning, a promise. Each one snarled as if to say, step carefully, for the goddess who rules here does not forgive lightly. The processional way stretched beyond, paved with stones, used for rituals and festivals in her honor. Crowds would line the road, singing hymns, carrying offerings, the air alive with incense and music. The king himself would join these processions, not above the people but as another participant seeking her blessing. For all his titles, he still needed her favor. Without it, his crown meant nothing. The gate has survived in fragments, pieces of its brilliance, reconstructed in museums far from the land where it once stood. But even in pieces, it radiates power. You can sense how it once dwarfed the ordinary human, reminding every passerby that they were small beneath divine authority. This was architecture as theology, stone transformed into living myth. The gate also tells you how deeply woven Ishtar was into the identity of Babylon. She wasn't just one goddess among many. She was the guardian of entry, the power that framed the city's very existence. To pass through the gate was to cross into her sphere, willingly or not. Even if you had no devotion in your heart, the walls would press it upon you. That's the kind of presence she commanded. Unavoidable, absolute, stitched into the very bricks of civilization. But even beyond monuments, her presence leaked into private spaces. Amulets carved with her symbols were worn for protection. Little clay figurines of the goddess were tucked into households. Some showed her winged, standing on lions. Others nude, holding her breasts, fertility embodied. These were not works for display in grand temples. They were intimate, meant to sit on shelves, to guard doorways, to whisper a reminder that the goddess was watching over or watching for an opportunity to strike. The duality of those images is striking. In one house, she might be invoked to bless a marriage bed. In another, she might be prayed to for vengeance against a rival. Love and wrath, side by side, never separate. Even in the smallest figurine, she retained her complexity. To own one was to admit you lived under her shadow, and maybe to try to bring that shadow onto your side, and her shadow extended into law. Some ancient codes reference her temples as sanctuaries, places where the accused could flee for safety. But safety under Ishtar's eye was never simple. Protection came with conditions, obligations, rituals. She was not a goddess who offered mercy without cost. To step into her temple for refuge was to entangle yourself in her web, and webs are not easily escaped. Think of how that must have felt. A fugitive crossing the threshold, desperate, whispering prayers, surrounded by the echo of hymns, the scent of oil burning, knowing the goddess of war and love now held your fate. Did she see you as a lover to be spared, or as prey to be fed to lions? The uncertainty must have been unbearable, and yet people kept coming, because even terror was better than being abandoned outside her favor. In that way, her myths spilled into every corner of life, public or private, temple or home, king or commoner. No one lived beyond her reach. To say Ishtar ruled heaven and earth was not exaggeration. It was daily reality. If you trace her influence further, you start to see how Ishtar didn't remain confined to Mesopotamia. Like her star moving across the sky, she traveled. To the Canaanites, she became Astarte. To the Greeks, she left her mark on Aphrodite. To the Romans, she was Venus, glittering as morning and evening star. But notice something in these later guises. Much of her sharpness was softened. Aphrodite kept the beauty, the allure, the intoxicating power of desire. But she lost much of the lion's roar. Venus inspired love, but she rarely commanded armies. By then, cultures preferred their love goddesses less terrifying. Still, you can feel Ishtar's bones beneath those later masks. The star in the sky remained. The sense of irresistible attraction remained. Even the whispers of vengeance remained. But the balance shifted. The Greeks and Romans liked their stories to end with lessons about harmony or comedy or fate. The Mesopotamians knew better. They knew that love itself is as dangerous as war, that desire can shatter just as much as it heals. So when Aphrodite smiles, there's a shadow behind her teeth. When Venus rises bright, you can still imagine the old Mesopotamian hymn, "The lioness prowls the heavens." Even further afield, echoes linger. In India, some scholars point to parallels with goddesses like Durga and Kali figures, who embody beauty and destruction side by side. In the Bible, the prophets rail against the Queen of Heaven, almost certainly a memory of Ishtar's cult in the region. She was too powerful to be forgotten. Wherever her devotees traveled, they carried her flame with them. And like any flame, it caught. This spread wasn't just about religion. It was about survival of ideas. People saw something in Ishtar that matched human experience so closely that she could not die. Empires fell, cities burned, dynasties ended, but the goddess who was love and fury endured. She simply shifted her name, put on new jewelry, adopted a new accent. But behind the mask, the same eyes gleamed watchful, seductive, dangerous. What's fascinating is how this endurance shows up not only in myths, but in practice. Archaeologists have uncovered charms and offerings to Ishtar in layers of earth that span centuries, showing that devotion to her didn't just flicker, it roared across generations. A woman in one century left her prayer scratched into clay for fertility. A soldier in another buried a blade beside her statue for victory. Centuries apart, but both reaching for the same volatile goddess. That kind of continuity is rare. Even when empires tried to centralize religion around new gods, she slipped through the cracks. Official inscriptions might praise Marduk or Ashur, but in private, people still whispered Ishtar's name. It's as if she thrived in contradiction, publicly scorned at times, privately adored always. You can almost imagine her laughing at that, delighted to be both feared and irresistible. And she never stayed still. In later magical texts, she shows up as a name invoked in incantations, a presence at the edges of ritual. In astrology, Venus continued to mark her path across the sky, guiding predictions, shaping fates. Even when people forgot her name, they didn't forget the star. Every dawn and dusk, there she was, gleaming like an unblinking eye, daring you to look away. Think about how long that gaze has lasted. 5,000 years ago, a farmer in Sumer looked up and saw her light, whispered a prayer. 2,000 years ago, a Roman lover saw Venus rising and thought of passion. Tonight, you could step outside, see that same star, and feel the same pull. That is her true immortality. She doesn't need temples anymore. The sky is her temple. And as long as people fall in love, wage wars, crave power, or fear betrayal, Ishtar remains alive in every heartbeat. One of the most haunting aspects of Ishtar's story is her descent into the underworld, a tale that feels less like myth and more like a meditation on the nature of existence itself. Inanna, as she was known in Sumer, decides to descend into the realm of her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. No reason is entirely clear. Some versions say it was ambition, others curiosity, others a ritual necessity. But what matters is the act, the goddess of life, love, and war, stepping into the domain of death. At each of the 7 gates of the underworld, she is stripped, crown removed, jewelry taken, robes pulled away. By the final gate, she is left bare, powerless, vulnerable. It is a powerful image, the goddess who commanded kings and crushed armies reduced to nothing. And when she confronts Ereshkigal, she is judged, struck down, hung like a corpse on a hook. The world above withers in her absence. Crops fail, animals refuse to mate, humans weaken. Life itself cannot continue without her. This myth was not just story, it was explanation. It answered why fertility falters, why seasons turn, why even love seems to vanish into grief. But it also reflected human fear, that even the strongest among us, even the divine, cannot escape death. To hear this tale in an ancient temple was to be reminded that power is fleeting, that all crowns can fall, and yet Ishtar does not remain in the dark forever. Through rituals and bargains, she returns. But her return requires sacrifice. Her lover Dumuzi is taken in her place, dragged below, condemned to spend part of each year in death's embrace. This became myth's way of explaining the cycle of seasons, part of the year fruitful, part barren. A cosmic exchange written into human time. And at the heart of it is Ishtar, proving that even gods cannot grasp without giving, cannot love without loss. If you picture this descent as ritual drama, you begin to see why it mattered so much to her worshippers. Imagine the temple filled with priests, chanting, perhaps even acting out her stripping at the gates, her judgment, her return. To watch that was to live through the cycle of despair and renewal. It was a reassurance that even in death there is return, even in loss there is continuity, and yet the cost is always real. Someone must go down in her place. The myth doesn't offer easy comfort. It acknowledges the truth you know in your bones. Every joy is paid for. Every rebirth requires a death. This gave her cult a particular gravity. Other gods promised victory, prosperity, stability. Ishtar promised truth, and the truth was not soft. It was that life and death are interwoven, that desire and destruction are twins. When you prayed to her, you weren't asking for safety. You were asking to endure the storm, to survive the paradox, to embrace the fire even knowing it could burn. It's also striking how this myth shaped later traditions. Persephone in Greece, dragged into the underworld, spending part of the year below. Inanna's bones are there. Even the Christian sense of descent and resurrection carries a faint echo of her journey down into death, up into life again. Ishtar set the pattern, and the pattern endured. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: she went willingly. Unlike Persephone, she was not kidnapped. She chose to descend. That choice makes her terrifying, because it means she is not only the goddess of love and war, she is the goddess who dares the dark. And if you find yourself face to face with her, you must remember, nothing you offer is beyond her reach. Not your heart, not your life, not even your death. If you pause on that detail, her willing descent, it reshapes the way you see Ishtar entirely. Most gods cling to their realms, guarding their domains jealously. But she crosses boundaries. She goes where she doesn't belong, breaks rules, tests limits. That is what makes her dangerous. She doesn't respect order. She disrupts it. And disruption is both terrifying and necessary. Without it, there is no change. Without it, life would calcify. So when she walked into the underworld, she wasn't just tempting fate. She was embodying the principle that nothing stays still, not even the divine. This transgression ripples through her myths. Every time she takes a lover, she crosses boundaries from shepherd kings to wild animals, from mortals to gods. Every time she enters battle, she oversteps what love goddesses are supposed to do. Every time she bargains with Ereshkigal or demands vengeance from Anu, she pushes past what even the gods expect of her. She does not accept limits, and that is why she commands both awe and fear. Because in a world of fragile hierarchies, fragile harvests, fragile lives, here was a force that refused to stay put. If you were an ancient listener, that must have been both inspiring and terrifying. Inspiring, because it suggested that even the strongest walls could be breached. Terrifying, because it meant even your safety was temporary. Ishtar could arrive at any time, demanding, devouring, consuming. You could never fully relax under her gaze. And yet, perhaps you wouldn't want to, because what is life without disruption? Without the sudden surge of desire, without the upheaval of passion, without the risk of war? She embodied the truth that to live fully is to live dangerously. That danger carried into her cult rituals, which, if we believe the records, were anything but tame. Some accounts speak of sacred marriage rites, where kings symbolically or perhaps literally united with the goddess through her priestess. Others mention festivals of ecstasy, music and dance filling the streets, boundaries between sacred and profane dissolving. To participate was to risk losing yourself, to be swept into her current, to stand exposed under her star. And isn't that the point? Worship of Ishtar was not meant to be comfortable, it was meant to be overwhelming. The sacred marriage especially reveals how power was thought to flow. The king, the supposed master of his people, had to bow to her, to take on the role of lover, of consort. His strength was not his own, it was borrowed from her embrace. Without her sanction, his throne would crumble. The rite was both affirmation and warning. Affirmation that she blessed his reign, warning that if he failed her, his reign could collapse like the discarded husks of her other lovers. And yet, beyond the grandeur of kings, ordinary people carried her in quieter ways. Women sang to her for fertility, soldiers carried amulets into battle, merchants left offerings before journeys. Every prayer carried a double-edged hope and fear intertwined. You never prayed to Ishtar lightly. You prayed with trembling hands, because you knew she might grant your wish or twist it into ruin. That duality was not a flaw, it was her essence. And perhaps that is why her worship lasted so long. Because deep down, everyone understood that life itself is never one thing. It is joy and grief, passion and betrayal, war and peace. Ishtar simply refused to disguise that truth. She showed it in its rawest form. And if you could survive her, you could survive anything. By the time her worship began to fade, replaced by newer gods and newer empires, Ishtar had already woven herself too deeply into the fabric of human imagination to ever truly vanish. Even as temples fell into ruin and hymns grew silent, her essence shifted into other forms, other names. You can almost picture her watching, amused, as her star was renamed Venus, as her stories were retold in gentler tones by Greeks and Romans. She had been softened for new audiences, but the fire was still there, hidden beneath layers of marble and poetry. The ancients who once trembled at her knew that nothing could erase her. She was written into the night sky itself. It's easy to think of her as just another mythic relic, a chapter closed. But the truth is, she's been hiding in plain sight. Every time a story is told about love that destroys as much as it heals, every time desire leads to ruin, every time passion sparks conflict, you're seeing her fingerprints. When Shakespeare wrote of love that kills, when painters showed Venus with a sly, knowing smile, when poets compared beauty to fire, they were echoing Ishtar, whether they knew it or not. She is in every tale, where longing becomes dangerous, where joy and loss walk hand in hand. And if you step outside at dawn or dusk and see that brilliant star, you're seeing what Mesopotamians saw 5,000 years ago. They gave it a name, wrapped it in myths, feared it, loved it. But the star itself hasn't changed. It still burns steady, a reminder that some things outlast empires, outlast languages, outlast even memory. You can call it Venus now. They called it Ishtar. Either way, it is still the same unblinking eye, shining down, daring you to look back. So why wouldn't you survive crossing paths with Ishtar? Because she is not just a goddess in a story. She is the embodiment of the forces you can't tame: desire, war, death, change itself. To meet her is to stand in the fire of life unfiltered. And who can endure that for long? Gilgamesh couldn't. Dumuzi couldn't. Even kings with armies and priests at their side trembled when invoking her. She was too vast, too contradictory, too alive. And in that sense, she is still with us. You survive by avoiding the lion's gaze, by pretending the flame won't burn you. But everyone knows that's a lie. Desire catches you off guard. Love twists you inside out. War erupts where you least expect it. Loss comes without warning. These are not accidents, they are Ishtar's eternal dance. She doesn't appear in shining armor at your door, but she moves through your life all the same. You feel her in the thrill that leaves you sleepless, in the heartbreak that leaves you hollow, in the conflict that reshapes your world. The ancients understood this. That's why they prayed, sang, built gates, carved lions, wrote hymns. Not to control her, because she could not be controlled, but to acknowledge her. To survive, you had to face the truth she represented. Life is dangerous. Desire is double-edged. Love and death are bound together. Crossing her path was inevitable. Surviving it was another matter. And yet, in the end, isn't that what makes her unforgettable? She is not safe, not kind, not consistent, but she is real in a way that still resonates. Look up tonight. See her star. Remember that 5 millennia ago, someone else did the same, whispering her name with awe and fear. And in that long, unbroken chain of gazes, she lives. Ishtar, always rising, always falling, never gone. And so the story of Ishtar comes to a close. But yet in truth, it never really ends. Her star still burns in the sky at dawn and dusk, just as it did for the ancients who whispered her name in awe and fear. She was love and war, passion and destruction, beauty and terror bound into one unrelenting force. A goddess who could not be tamed, only endured. Perhaps that's why her myths still echo after thousands of years, because deep down, you know her. You've felt her in longing that consumes, in heartbreak that leaves scars, in the fire of desire and the sting of loss. She has never left us, and she never will. Before you drift off, remember to like this video and subscribe for more long, immersive journeys into the myths and mysteries of the ancient world. And may Ishtar's star watch over your dreams tonight.